So, Game Masters, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much would you like to shake up things in your stories? Oh, I'm sorry. I completely misread the script there. Let me try that again. So, Game Masters, on a Richter scale of 1 to 10, how much would you like to shake up things in your story? Let's talk about using natural disasters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hey, it's in my name and everything. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who probably should not let his players know that I just found the words lava bomb inside of the game mastering section of the Pathfinder core rulebook. They don't need to know that I'm aware of this. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we are continuing my Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e series, where we take a look at the tips, the tricks, and the advice that Paizo offers storytellers for Pathfinder 2e. In particular today, we're going to be talking about how the Pathfinder 2e rules can handle natural disasters like earthquakes, wildfires, and other extreme phenomena such as that. Now, this series is intended for storytellers of every skill level from beginner to advanced, and even if Pathfinder 2e is not necessarily your preferred game, I still encourage you to stick around and be a part of the conversation. I have learned that when you study a multitude of games, you can often pick up some interesting ideas to bring back to your preferred game, and so I hope that this series will be beneficial to anyone and everyone who enjoys storytelling RPGs as a hobby. Now, to give you some context for the conversation we're having today, we have been working through the different modes of play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. We started with Encounter mode, and then we moved on to Exploration mode, which is where we're at now, and eventually we'll move on to Downtime mode. And as part of Exploration mode, we have been spending some time looking at the environment inside of an RPG. In fact, we've been discussing environment for a few videos now, and the rules for natural disasters are going to make reference to many of the things we have already discussed in the last couple of videos. So I strongly encourage you, if you have not seen my video on the environments or on the weather and climate, please go and check those out. I'll throw a video link up here and in the video description just in case you need that. But please be aware that some of the stuff we talk about in this video may not make much sense to you if you have not seen those previous videos, so I do encourage you to check those out first. Now, we do have a lot to dive into on this video, but I do want to go ahead and give you some references that you can use as a storyteller for handling natural disasters in your story. So really quick, here are some places you can check out if you want to read up on this yourself. First off, the core rulebook discusses natural disasters, and in particular the ones we're talking about today, on pages 518 to 519 in the Game Mastering chapter. So those pages are definitely core to today's conversation. However, there are a number of different tables and references in the core rulebook that you will probably find helpful as a storyteller. First off, tables 10.4, 10.5, and 10.6, which discuss DCs and DC adjustments, how to set those and use those in your game. Those tables are going to be very applicable to this conversation. And then tables 10.11, 10.12, and 10.13, which we discussed in the previous video, are also going to be very useful. They talk about environmental damage, environmental features, and the effects of different temperatures. Probably the most important terms you'll need to be aware of in this video are discussed on table 10.11, which is the environmental damage table, which discusses mild, moderate, major, and massive environmental damage, and the scale that you will need to use as a game master when applying those particular effects. So those are some of the tables you can use to pull specific numbers for this conversation, But I do think that there are some other handy references that you might be able to use as a storyteller that could serve as a shortcut in some instances. For example, as a game master, you might want to check out the rules for using and creating hazards. And when we're talking about natural disasters, you can probably use the rules for simple hazards to reflect certain effects associated with a hazard that you might be portraying in your story. So, for example, you could describe an earthquake that is affecting a particular region, but then maybe use the rules for a hazard to apply the effects of whatever specific thing your party might be dealing with in your story. So hazards can be a good shortcut if you want to quickly implement natural disasters in your story without having to reference several different resources. This can be particularly useful at low-level play. The final thing that you might want to reference in portraying natural disasters is basically just the primal spell list. There are a lot of spells that the primal spell list uses, such as the 8th level spell Earthquake, that are in one way or another attempting to emulate a natural disaster. And if you as a storyteller are looking for ways to use natural disasters, but you don't have time to go through the full spread of rules to do everything in its nuanced detail, pulling out a primal spell and letting that emulate what you're trying to have in the story, that could be another effective shortcut as well. So I know that's a lot of potential references, but as a game master, I want to give you several options for how you can approach using natural disasters so that you can easily and effectively determine the mechanical impact of the disaster and then move on to the more important story impact of the disaster that you're using. Whew, that was a lot of references. Let's get started. Now first I want to talk about the big picture, I guess you could say mechanically, of trying to use natural disasters in your story, which is, are you trying to kill your party? As a game master, we all know the answer is maybe. But seriously, when we talk about using natural disasters inside of an RPG and inside of a system like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, it is important to recognize the incredible scale of natural disasters. A natural disaster is not a threat to a person. It is a threat to a community, sometimes to several communities. Recently, in my home state of Kentucky, a major tornado came through and did terrible damage to multiple communities in my home state. By the way, if you're interested in helping out with that, I strongly recommend donating to the American Red Cross. They are doing some fantastic work. I know some of the people who work in the American Red Cross in my state, and I know some of the amazing things they're doing for the people affected by that disaster. So there is a link in the video description if you're interested in helping with that. But when you talk about natural disasters, understand that this is not a personal scale event. This is a community scale event or a regional scale event. This is a threat that goes beyond a single person. And if you want to use a natural disaster narratively, that's the scale you need to be playing with. Typically speaking, a natural disaster is not something that your player characters fight. It's something that your player characters hope to survive. And short of some of the most powerful magic in Pathfinder 2e, like Miracle or Wish, natural disasters should be game-changing in terms of what happens both before and after that particular event. This, by the way, is reflected in the rules for natural disasters. If you were to take a look at Table 1012, which talks about environmental features and the typical skill checks associated with environmental features, if you pay attention to the natural disasters on that list, you'll notice that every single one of them has potential skill check DCs that can go up to legendary. Sure, you can find some master skill check DCs as possible options, and I think on one occasion there's an expert DC listed as a possible option, but every single natural disaster has the potential to be legendary. So if you're thinking on that scale, that kind of sets the tone for this conversation. Last week when we discussed weather and climate, we talked about how less is more. That when you use regular weather, you want to keep the penalties and the damage and the impact to your players relatively light. That's not true with natural disasters. You are taking off the gloves as a GM and you are hitting them fast and hard. Environmental damage on this should never be minor. Rarely should it be moderate, and typically it should be major or massive. These are truly life-threatening events. So if I'm not making this point clearly enough, if you want to direct a natural disaster at your party, this is high-level material. I would not throw any of these natural disasters directly at my player characters before level 7, and honestly, levels 10 to 15, maybe even higher for some of these instances, might be much more appropriate. If you throw this stuff at a low-level party, you are probably asking for a TPK, and if you want to use natural disasters with a low-level party, it is probably better to allow them to deal with the natural disaster indirectly rather than facing the events head-on. So, Game Masters, just hear me when I say, understand the scale that you are using when you invoke a natural disaster, and be cautious when and how you apply it, because if you throw the full force of a natural disaster at a low-level or unprepared party, you do run the risk of just annihilating your game. So you want to use events like this carefully and deliberately, and know what you're doing before you dive in. But now, let's talk about the different types of natural disasters that Paizo mentions that you might be able to use as a storyteller. Now, there are several different types of natural disasters that are discussed in this section, and I will admit that the rules are a little bit thin on these natural disasters. As a game master, if you want to use these particular devices, you will need to spend some time deciding exactly how you want to implement them. For all of these, Paizo kind of gives you a range of options, and you'll have to pick out exactly what you want to do. Now, there are a couple of natural disasters that are pretty much covered by the rules we have already discussed in previous videos, and that is floods and blizzards. When we talked about the rules for an aquatic environment and the things you want to be mindful of as a storyteller, that kind of covers most of the information you need to know for floods. Pretty much the only difference between aquatic environment and a flood is whether or not the player characters were expecting the aquatic environment before the adventure began. But every threat that you would associate with an aquatic environment, you would associate with a flood. You're just ramping up the scale of the dangers associated with that kind of environment. So if you want to use floods, check out the rules for an aquatic environment and think about how they would apply to the particular circumstance that you're running. The other disaster that we've kind of covered before is blizzards. In the previous video, we talked about the effects of temperature and the dangers that might be associated with extreme temperatures. And blizzards are what happen when I get hungry in the middle of shooting a video and run down the street to my local Dairy Queen. Wait, I'm sorry, wrong script. And blizzards are what happen when you hit those extremes of cold temperature. So everything we talked about in cold climates and cold temperatures in the previous video, that applies here. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on floods or blizzards because we've already kind of talked about those topics before. But both of those natural disasters can segue into another conversation that is honestly common to a lot of these natural disasters, and that is the concept of a collapse. And a collapse is basically when the player characters are inside of something and it falls down. They can be inside a cave that is collapsing, they can be inside a building that is collapsing, but suddenly what they thought was a refuge or a place of safety is turning into a potential tomb for your player characters. Now, Paizo does note that a collapse is a specific type of disaster which is confined to a specific area. So if your player characters are in a cave and a collapse occurs, if they escape that particular area of the cave, then they will have essentially evaded the danger. Mechanically, inside the game, a collapse stays in one area. It doesn't spread to other areas without some other aggravating event causing that disaster to spread. One building collapsing doesn't necessarily knock over every building unless there's something that would cause that disaster to move from one building to the next. But just about any natural disaster can potentially lead to a collapse, and when you're running a collapse scenario, there are a few things you want to keep in mind. First off, characters that are caught in a collapse will typically be subjected to bludgeoning damage, and the books suggest a major to massive amount of damage. Players should typically be allowed a reflex save to help mitigate some of that damage. And after the reflex save, the character is likely going to be buried. The book actually notes that a critical success is typically necessary to avoid being buried alive. This is harsh. Again, Game Masters, use with caution. The book further notes that if you've been buried alive, typically you should not be able to free yourself from being buried alive following a collapse. Again, harsh. Game Masters, use with caution. I'm serious, this is a common piece of advice in this video. If a character has been buried alive, other characters can attempt to free that character by using an athletics check to try and clear the rubble. The book does note that if they have appropriate tools, such as shovels or crowbars or something else that might help them move debris faster, that they might be able to clear more debris quickly in an attempt to rescue a buried character. Furthermore, a character that has been buried alive, in certain situations, may be in danger of suffocation if they don't have an adequate air supply. So if you can't tell here, collapses are really dangerous. As a game master, I would use these very sparingly, or I would consider allowing some alternative ways for characters to escape if they've been buried alive. This is a pretty heavy-hitting part of the rules, and honestly, with any natural disaster, this is a situation your players could find themselves in. A very similar set of rules is Avalanches and rock slides, where lots of snow or lots of debris suddenly goes careening down a mountain. The book does note that rock slides and mudslides can occasionally be slow enough that characters would be able to outrun them or at least be able to run to a point of safety as long as they see those disasters coming. But avalanches often move way too quickly, and once the avalanche or once the rock slide or mudslide hits the player character, you find yourself back in what is essentially the collapse scenario. Major to massive amounts of damage, make a reflex save to reduce the damage, but you need a critical reflex save to avoid being buried alive. All of those things we just talked about, that's kind of part of the picture here. So again, this is a pretty rough rule set, and as a game master, I would be very hesitant about applying it too quickly or too often at the risk of accidentally TPKing my party. In case you're interested of combining all of the insanity of potential collapses with all of the insanity of flooding, tsunamis are another option that are discussed in the book. Now with tsunamis, your player characters would be facing massive amounts of bludgeoning damage and also run the risk of being pushed along by the water in whatever direction the tsunami might be traveling. Characters who are hit by a tsunami could wind up in a very different spot from where they originally started before the disaster began. If you're looking for a disaster that doesn't have quite the scale of potential TPK, you might try looking at something like the sandstorm. Sandstorms offer a good step between the weather and climate rules we discussed last video and the absurd natural disaster rules that we're talking about in this video. Sandstorms can inflict some pretty serious environmental penalties to skill checks, especially to something like vision, and characters will definitely need to take steps to protect themselves from environmental damage from the sandstorm, though the book does note that even for heavy sandstorms, you're still only probably looking at a minor amount of slashing damage that the player characters are going to be dealing with. However, there still is the potential threat in sandstorms that a character might begin to suffocate if too much debris or grit begins to clog up their airways. So if a character is not responding to the threat of the sandstorm appropriately, the terror level can escalate pretty quickly. Another natural disaster that might be a little bit easier to use as a storyteller is a wildfire. Now, one of the advantages of a wildfire is the distances that you can use in applying a wildfire. Characters can potentially see the smoke and the flames from a wildfire from a great distance away, giving your party more time to react and prepare for what is at hand. The book notes that the typical wildfire can spread at a speed of about 7 miles per hour or 70 feet per round, which is pretty extreme but doesn't completely negate your character's chance to escape. But it also notes that the embers from a wildfire can scatter other smaller fires up to 10 miles away. So when the players see one wildfire approaching, there might actually be multiple threats that spring up from this one incident. Now when you talk about wildfires mechanically, The environmental damage from the heat of the fire is going to depend upon how close to the core of the fire that your player characters are. If they're dealing with smaller flames or smaller incidents, they might be facing moderate amounts of environmental damage, and if they're caught in the middle of the raging inferno that is the core of the wildfire, that would definitely qualify as massive amounts of damage. Another thing you want to consider with wildfires is smoke. Smoke is going to obscure vision and it's going to make breathing difficult. So, much like we talked about with the sandstorm, characters that aren't taking steps to protect their lungs, protect their eyes, could find themselves facing severe penalties or possibly even suffocating from the dangers that the wildfire poses. But one of the fun aspects of a wildfire is it can actually represent kind of an extended challenge for your players, and your players might have to spend a lot of time trying to get out of the range of that potential threat. Another disaster that has a lot of potential to bring multiple threats into play is an earthquake. With earthquakes, you don't just have the main natural disaster itself. You can have tremors before the earthquake and aftershocks after the earthquake. There are plenty of opportunities to make an earthquake an ongoing threat for your players. And with earthquakes, one of the big threats is the collapses that we talked about earlier. The building that they're in, it collapses, or something else falls down around them and puts them in danger of being buried alive. Other potential threats in an earthquake include fissures opening up and characters falling in, or tremors causing things to fall down and hit your players. And in these instances, you could be looking at moderate, major, maybe even massive amounts of bludgeoning damage. The book also mentions soil liquefaction as one of the possible threats of an earthquake, and not gonna lie, that one scares me a bit. The book actually recommends referencing the earthquake spell from the primal spell list if you're interested in portraying that particular threat that's associated with earthquakes. And on a vein similar to earthquakes, another disaster that has the potential to really offer a bunch of different threats is a volcanic eruption. Volcanic eruptions often occur in stages and might even last over several days and could present a number of different threats to your players. For example, vents might open up in the ground, releasing toxic gas or acidic gas and exposing your players to potential threats. Ash can play a role similar to smoke that we talked about with wildfires, obscuring vision or threatening suffocation for characters who haven't taken the appropriate precautions. And then you have things like lava flow and pyroclastic flow. Now the book does note that the movement speed of lava flows can vary, but a lot of lava flows move slow enough that a character who is aware of the threat can naturally outrun the threat. Buildings might be in danger, but as long as the character is not caught off guard, they shouldn't be caught inside of the lava flow. However, the lava flow is still dangerous, and characters that encounter the heat of the lava flow are subjected to minor amounts of environmental damage, and a character foolish enough to go swimming in lava, I once had a player that foolish, should be subjected to massive amounts of environmental damage instead. For a more immediate threat, you can look at pyroclastic flows, which are volatile mixes of gases and rock that move at speeds much more akin to an avalanche than to the typical lava flow. These can expose your players to tons of damage, the possibility of being buried alive, and just about every other threat that we've talked about so far. However, by far the most entertaining, if not the most damaging thing that you can do with a volcanic eruption is lava bombs. Balls of molten rock being flung into the air that could fall on your players at any point in time. As a game master, how can you not use this? Now, it's worth noting that a lava bomb deals a moderate amount of bludgeoning damage and a moderate amount of fire damage when it explodes in contact with the ground. So yes, that damage does add up to something more significant than moderate. As a game master, I feel like this is one of the more entertaining things that you can do with a volcanic eruption, and I feel like it is more mechanically balanced against what your player character should be able to handle, so this is definitely a rule I think is available at the gaming table. But now we come to the last natural disaster that is discussed in the core rulebook, and I saved this one for last because honestly it's just my favorite, and I have a bad habit of dropping this on my players at least once a campaign, and that is a tornado. In full disclosure, I was one of those kids that I'm surprised actually survived to adulthood, because I was one of those kids that was out on the porch looking for the tornado when I was growing up, Not the brightest suggestion. I advise not doing that. Tornadoes do make use of some of the wind rules that we discussed previously in the video on weather, and anyone in the path of the tornado should expect some severe circumstance penalties related to those high winds. However, those high winds come with an additional condition that you need to be aware of. A character that would be blown away instead gets pulled up into the funnel of the tornado. The book notes that characters should take massive bludgeoning damage from debris inside of the funnel cloud, such as flying cows, maybe? Yeah, you knew I was throwing a Twister reference in here. And then at some point the character should be ejected from the funnel and again take massive bludgeoning damage from the resulting fall. Tornadoes travel about 30 miles per hour or about 300 feet around, meaning that the typical player character should not have any chance of outrunning one, and they should make a desperate sprint for cover or they're going to be in serious danger. But that was a quick look at the different natural disasters that are discussed inside of the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook. As I've mentioned, for all of these, Paizo gives us a range of options, a scale of damage, a scale of DCs that we might use as a storyteller. If you want to use any of these in your game, you do need to make some judgment calls about what you think the appropriate DCs should be, and what you think the appropriate damage your player characters might suffer would be if they get caught in one of these events. Again, as a storyteller, please remember that these events are not a player character scale threat. They are intended to be a threat to entire communities, maybe even to entire regions, and player characters who are staring down one of these threats should know and recognize that they are in immense danger. Do not use these rules haphazardly, or you could run the risk of killing off several player characters when you didn't intend to. But if you need an event that is truly going to reshape the landscape of whatever game you're running, natural disasters could be a very powerful story moment you can use, and characters that survive the event will probably remember the thrill and the danger long after it is over. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts about using natural disasters in RPGs like Pathfinder 2e? Have you dropped one of these natural disasters on your party, and if so, how did they fare? Have you used natural disasters in a different RPG, and how did those systems handle those kinds of events? Leave your thoughts in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, subscribe to the channel to be part of the ongoing conversation. You can check out my free Discord group or my Patreon page, both of which are linked in the video description below. And as I mentioned earlier, if you're interested in helping out the victims of the tornadoes in Kentucky, you can check out the link to the American Red Cross that I have down there as well. Again, I know the people who are doing some of this work personally. I'm aware of the things that are going on near my hometown. So trust me, if you want to make a donation, you can donate through the American Red Cross and good will be done with that. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.